Okay, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences conversation series. My name is Nazem Chichek, and I'm the Associate Dean Research in the faculty. The title of today's seminar is What Bugs a Farmer's Crops? Assessing Damage in Canola. So let me begin by stating that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands, the Anishinaabe, Nunavut, Anishinaabe, Dakota Oyate, and Denisoline, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So if you're new to the Faculty Conversation series, this is our virtual seminar series where we highlight some of our innovative research in an engaging discussion format. And if you missed our previous seminars, there is certainly an opportunity for you to view them right here on our faculty's YouTube channel, as well as on makemanitoba.ca, which is the Manitoba Agriculture and Food Knowledge Exchange. So you can find past links of seminars there. Now, makemanitoba.ca generally highlights our faculty's research as it relates to both consumers and producers, with links to things like podcasts, infographics, fact sheets, and even some recipes. All right, so today we have three speakers who will share with us a short summary of their research, and then we'll engage together in a conversation. You as a viewer can participate in this conversation by sending in your questions and comments via the chat platform Slido. So right now I'd like to call on Crystal Jorgensen, the faculty's communications specialist, to provide some guidance on how the audience can actually participate in the presentation. Crystal?
Thanks, Nazem. Welcome everyone who's joined us here today. We hope that you can help us out with some questions for our guests, our speakers today. And to do that, you might open another browser window and type in www.slido.com. And when you're there, you can enter in the event code #CanolaBugs, all one word. And as soon as you're in there, at any time, you can start adding questions. We will work through those in a chronological order. So as they come in, when we get to the Q&A portion at the end, we'll go through them in that order. The question field is a little bit limited in character count, so we just ask that you keep your question a bit succinct. And to kick it off, I'd love to know where everyone's watching from today. And with that, Nazem, I'll turn it back to you, and we'll revisit these instructions later.
Thanks, Crystal. So let's get right to it. Canola is, of course, a very well-known crop to those of us here at the University of Manitoba. It has often been called the Cinderella crop for its rise from fairly humble oilseed beginnings to a crop now grown globally. And Canada is the world's largest producer of canola, followed by the European Union and China. Just between 2016 and 2019, canola contributed nearly $30 billion and 207,000 full-time jobs to the Canadian economy. So you can see the impact it has on the country. But as with any crop, there are pests, and flea beetles are the most economically significant pests of canola here in Canada. There's some others. They include lygus bugs, armyworms, and weevils. So today's conversation will bring together three experts in entomology who have studied these canola pests, and they will provide us with some perspectives on our current progress to find environmentally friendly solutions to manage these pests and what lies ahead. So without further ado, let me start by introducing our guests. Please welcome Dr. Alejandro Costamagna, who's a professor in the Department of Entomology here at the University of Manitoba. Ale's research focuses on sustainable methods to control arthropod pests in agricultural systems. His research projects include studying the effects of landscape complexity, natural enemies, crop diversity, cover crops, and plant resistance on different pests of canola, wheat, and soybean. Ale obtained his MSc and PhD in entomology at Michigan State University and did postdoctoral studies at the University of Minnesota and CSIRO in Australia before joining us, the University of Manitoba, in 2011. So let me turn it over to Ale. Go ahead, Ale.
Thank you very much, Nazem, for the introduction and the opportunity to talk about our research in canola pests. So I would like to introduce flea beetles first that are well known for canola growers. These are small beetles less than 4 millimeters in size that can be potentially devastating. They're considered the #1 pest for canola in the prairies. And there are two species that are of main concern. One is the crucifer flea beetle, the one on the top there in the picture that's completely black. And the other one is the striped flea beetle, which is very similar. They produce pretty much the same damage. You can't distinguish their damage. And they both damage the plant mainly as adults when the plants are small seedlings growing at the beginning of the spring. These two species are exotic. One of them, the striped flea beetle, may actually be all Arctic, so it might have been here for a while, but the other one seems to be introduced, which means there doesn't seem to be good natural enemies controlling them at the point. So growers rely mostly on chemical controls at the moment. So here you have a couple of pictures that are not very good. I took them with my phone with some of the damage, but just to show you that they are quite capable of aggregating in high numbers, produce little holes in the cotyledons of the plants, and can produce lots of damage that way. They are brassica specialists, so canola is a part of these groups of plants called brassicas that happen to be well defended against a lot of herbivores, a lot of insect pests. But the downside of that, having those specific chemicals that protect the plants against a wide variety of herbivores, is that the herbivores that adapt to attack them actually become specialized on them. And that's the case for flea beetles, that they're quite capable of detecting these plants from long distance, any of these brassicas, and attack them, and that's why they're important pests. Here, I'll go very briefly about the life cycle. The most important thing to remark here is that they overwinter as adults. They spend the winter in the border of the fields or hedgerows or woodlots, protected by the snow cover from the cold temperatures. And as soon as we have a nice day like today, here at least in Manitoba, over 15 degrees Celsius, the adults become active. They spend the whole winter waiting for this time, so they're quite hungry, so they will start looking for all these brassicas. And of course, the main crop they have in the prairies in a couple of weeks will be canola to attack. So they can be potentially quite devastating depending on how the emergence of canola co-occurs with the peak of adults moving out of overwintering. After they feed on the spring, that they can cause damage at up to 2.4, so 2 true leaves in canola. They will lay their eggs on the soil. The larvae will, which are very, very small, they will feed on the roots of the plants. They don't cause any economic damage as larvae, as far as we can tell from previous research and observations. And then they will pupate, emerge as adults late in the summer. And those adults typically will be the ones that will go to overwinter until next year. Now, there's some evidence that with global warming, there might be another generation occurring of some of these species in the prairies, but typically we expect to have only one generation. So the important part here is that they are pests only when the canolas are small seedlings, and that then the only really available method to control them is to use insecticides. And pretty much all the growers buy seeds treated with systemic insecticides that protect the plants when they're seedlings. So most of the canola you'll see is treated with seed insecticides. If that fails and there's still defoliation that's very appreciable, then there's a nominal threshold which is about 25% defoliation, and at that level, the growers will decide to apply a foliar insecticide if the damage continues to increase. And in some cases, they may even replant the field if the damage is very extensive. So despite this widespread use of seed insecticide, there are still foliar applications needed. And the last thing I want to say for the introduction is that, as I alluded before, these flea beetles usually don't overwinter in the field that the canola is planted because canola is rotated like many other crops, so they need to come from somewhere to the field. They typically may come from field borders, but they might come from farther apart within the farm, or even from longer distances, and we don't have a good idea of how far they can move, but of course they can fly. They're called flea beetles because they can hop like fleas, but they can fly certainly long distances if needed. So it is important to understand that what happens in these canola fields is heavily influenced by what happened in other fields around in what we call the landscape scale. So that's what we are trying to study, to see how the composition of fields, the amount of canola, the size of the fields of canola within a landscape really affects the abundance of these two flea beetle species and the damage they cause. And the other thing that those fields may affect is the presence of beneficial insects, of predators. So here's a picture of at the right, I guess there's a picture of a ground beetle trying to eat a striped flea beetle. We did some lab experiments with the students in here and found that several species of carabids, which are ground beetles, and spiders can eat flea beetles. So there are a number of beneficial insects on the farm that also move into these fields to try to control the flea beetles. And with that, I think that's enough of me talking. So I'll turn it to Nassim.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. This is an excellent introduction to our topic today, and great images. So let me welcome our next guest, Dr. Hector Carcamo. Hector is a senior research scientist with the Science and Technology branch of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at the Lethbridge Research and Development Center located in southern Alberta. He's also an adjunct professor here at the University of Manitoba. For the past 25 years, Hector has been researching management strategies for insect pests of canola, cereals, alfalfa, and pulse crops. Hector was born in El Salvador and lived in Belize before immigrating to Canada in the early 1980s. He obtained his BSc and MSc from the University of Alberta in agricultural entomology and a PhD from the University of Calgary in biological sciences. So go ahead, Hector.
Good afternoon. Yaktutak, Gengang Nemit. That's my greeting in my ancestral Nahuatl language. I thought I should sneak that in. Thank you very much for that introduction. And many thanks to the organizers. It's a real pleasure to be here. I love to talk about insects and what kind of pest issues we encounter, and also to talk about how we can manage them. So in the next 3-4 minutes, I'm going to give you a very quick introduction to what Lygus bugs are. Lygus bugs, unlike flea beetles, they are native insect pests, and that means that they have been here forever, and they are very widespread. You can actually find Lygus bugs in Northern Europe, as well as in Northern Canada, Southern Canada, the US. And Lygus love to feed on pretty much all crops. The Lygus bugs that we have in North America, they prefer to feed on broadleaf crops, although you can still find them in cereal crops. You can also find Lygus bugs in tree nursery crops. So they are extremely widespread, and they are not very picky about what they eat. Any plant will have growing tissues. Every plant will have flowers, so they love flowers, and canola is a really good flower. Probably before we had agriculture, Lygus bugs were kind of struggling, going around trying to find food, and then we came and started planting all these crops in these huge monocultures, and then Lygus bugs became extra happy because now they did not have to go very far to find very juicy, delicious canola flowers, and they love to eat the seeds. Lygus bugs, you can see a photo here on the right here. You can see it's not very nice photo, but You can kind of see the nymphal stages. Those are the baby Lygos when they're first instars. When they just come out of the eggs, they are just about 0.5 millimeter, so they're not very big. Then they keep growing and they go through 5 stages that we entomologists like to call instars. And eventually they become the adults that have fully developed wings. And then you can see the mouth parts of Lycus bugs. They're like a straw, and they love to use that straw-like proboscis, the mouth part, to insert it into the soft tissues of seeds, and then they suck the juice out, and then the poor canola seeds become very shrunk. And like I said before, Lycus bugs, they love to eat almost everything. So they also like to eat fava beans. And you can see a photo here. Fava beans, again, they're a pest at the early pod stage, same as canola. The early pod stage is the most vulnerable stage of the crop. And with canola, with the fava beans, it gets a bit more complicated, because with fava beans, if you get even 1 to 2% of the seed with necrotic damage, as you can see here, you can see all those dark spots on the fava bean grain. That level of damage will be enough to downgrade the quality of the seed from the more profitable human market, where they consume fava beans in salads. Then it will go down to feed for livestock, for pigs, and then the price will be extremely low compared to, or much lower compared to the other markets. So Lycus bugs become a bit of a challenging pest to manage, and in fava beans especially, it becomes a bit more complicated, because fava beans relies on pollination by honeybees and other bees, other pollinators. So you don't have the option to spray too much insecticide. Like most of our crops, we rely on insecticides to manage Lycus bugs. We don't have too many alternatives yet, and that has been the subject of our work for the past couple of decades. One really important question to ask about Lycus bugs, or actually for any insect pest: when is that insect an actual pest? Just because the insect is there does not mean that the insect is a pest. In fact, when Lycus bugs, and this applies to other insects, when insects are at low levels, they may actually stimulate the plant. And we have shown this in our experiments. We have caged Lycus bugs with canola plants. And if you have low levels of herbivory, you can actually stimulate the plant. We have to remember that insects and plants have had this very, very long history of kind of a love-hate relationship, where the insects have been attacking the plants and the plants have been involved in defenses and so on. So at low levels, Lycus bugs are not a pest. If you have a few Lycus bugs attacking the crop at the early flower stage, the plants can actually become more robust, and they can actually overyield and overcompensate. When the Lycus bugs continue to increase and they reach the populations when they are over 3 Lycus per sweep, this is how we monitor Lycus bugs. We use a sweep net. So when they reach more than 3 Lycus per sweep, then they do cause a very clear, very marked yield decrease, which can be highly economical and can result in losses to the farmer. Now, how do we manage Lycus bugs? So in addition to insecticides, I guess we have to monitor. Then we have to know the economic threshold and then apply that threshold. And it's really important that we apply these thresholds, because we know that in addition to insect pests, our agroecosystems are populated by many natural enemies. For example, for Lycus bugs, we have determined that we have fairly high levels of parasitism by a very tiny wasp called Peristinus. This wasp is only about 3 millimeters, and it can inflict reasonably good mortality on Lycus bugs in some areas. So conserving these beneficial insects is very important, and that is why it's crucial that we understand these economic thresholds, and also that we can apply them and we can monitor the crop. Another very important aspect of integrated pest management is cultural practices. And for Lycus bugs, we know that one can decrease the risk of Lycus damage to our crops by planting very early, because Lycus bugs have 2 or 3 generations depending on where they are, and climate change is actually exacerbating that. We now are seeing up to 3 generations in southern Alberta and in the southern prairies. But if you actually plant very early, you might be able to escape the Lygus pest in time. So as a summary, it's probably more than 4 minutes. We need to think about integrating various strategies. We need to understand the biology of the insects. We need to appreciate that insect-plant interaction and realizing that just because an insect is there, it does not mean that it's a pest. In some cases, it can be a beneficial insect and it can actually stimulate your crop yield. That's what I will say for my introduction, and hopefully we'll come back and discuss these topics in more detail in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hector. This was excellent. I really appreciated knowing more about your field, and we will certainly have time to discuss this in greater detail a bit further down the line. So next up, I would like to welcome Keith Gabert. Keith is the agronomy specialist with the Canola Council of Canada and has been their insect lead for more than 10 years. Keith's work experience prior to that included agricultural retail, pesticide research, canola variety testing, and breeder seed production. Keith currently resides with his wife and whichever children are still at home on a small number of acres in Red Deer County, Alberta. So take it away, Keith.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to chat with people like Hector and Alejandro. And my experience with insects is that growers are probably the most concerned about whichever insect they're the least familiar with. So we likely have a lot of insects that we're simply unaware of and are they're likely not doing any damage to our canola crop. But when we see growers get the most excited about Lygus is often when we have a young agronomist that's not yet swung a sweet net in canola. And if you go in after flowering, it's pretty normal in the territory that I'm at, Central Alberta, to swing a sweet net and find Lygus bugs often in relatively high numbers. So Hector was talking about some really interesting opportunities to manage Lygus, perhaps a biological control. The best control I've ever seen for Lygus was the year that Hector got his last round of funding in about 2016 or 2017. It was the first year in 20 years that I'd swung a net in my neighborhood and not found any Lygus in a sweet net. So I don't know if Hector will think that's funny or not, but the Egg Canada researchers and the university researchers that I've talked to are aware that, you know, the first thing that causes an insect population to really disappear is often that we realize it's a concern, we realize we need to do some work on it, and then we put some funds towards it, and all of a sudden they're not available in sufficient numbers. So I've done work with both Alejandro and Hector, but Hector in particular, when he started to talk about Lygus bugs and concern about that in our crop canola, I promised him that I could find him sites with really high levels of Lygus bugs, and it's probably not a promise you should make, because for the 2 or 3 years after I had said that statement, the numbers were relatively low. So I've swung a sweet net 10 times to find Lygus in the past, and my range is from 0 in 10 sweeps to 1,400 in 10 sweeps. So it's an interesting insect to look at. Flea beetles, on the other hand, all our canola growers in Western Canada are actually really familiar with this particular insect pest, but they're not a really consistent insect pest. And I might get in trouble for saying that, because we do have areas in the prairies that from 2000 to 2022, for 3 years in that area, they consistently had flea beetles as damage. And you'll see the picture on the screen showing some of the damage that causes this shot hole appearance. The flea beetle will chew a shot hole or a divot into the leaf. When it dries out, that tissue will die and often have a complete hole going through. We've got a really great infographic from the Canola Council that's on our Canola Encyclopedia that talks about 25 to 50% being the range of where you'd need to control this particular insect. But our canola cotyledons, those young, really susceptible plants, look really ugly at 10 or 15% damage. And the challenge is to get growers out and scouting for this insect, because I know it's going to be the most damaging insect pest, I would say, each and every year. But I simply can't predict which part of the prairies is going to have a concern, and it's rarely a single factor issue. So flea beetle damage seems to be really tied to poor plant establishment. So if you think about seeding depth and how deep a grower might seed, I've got a picture showing that as well. My experience with flea beetles is that if you get this crop struggling, or if you set it back in some way, or maybe it's just hot and dry, that flea beetles will then come take advantage of that. So one of the rule of thumbs we have on flea beetles is we'd like to see 3 to 4 leaves on your canola crop in 3 to 4 weeks, and that's a lot easier said than done. I think I'll leave it there for a joint discussion with Hector and the group, but open to any questions. The Canola Council has a lot of great resources on these pests and any others that growers are always calling or asking or looking on our website to get more information.
Great. Thanks, Keith. And thank you to all of you, Ale, Hector, and Keith, for a great introduction. So this is now a time for us to maybe have a more general discussion with the entire group on chatting about what producers can do to manage these pests in canola, and maybe even some other crops. Fava beans were mentioned. So I'm going to make sure that we bring the audience along eventually, but we'll start chatting for a little while first. And I have a few questions for the group, and maybe I'll just call you out one by one so you can, take a stab at these things. So, I mean, you all talked about insecticide application, economic thresholds, that they're very important. You don't want to over-apply. Obviously, there's, costs associated with these things, but there's also a sustainability question around insecticide application. So maybe let's start there. What are kind of the strategies that the producers should use to control these flea beetles or lygus bugs in a sustainable fashion? So some rules of thumb from your end. Maybe we'll start with Keith first from the industry side, and then hand it over to Ale and Hector.
Well, there's probably two messages that I'll steal from Hector and Ale. The one is to consider beneficials before you spray. So we do have a program within the industry called Field Heroes, which does a really good job of promoting the idea that there's other insects in your crop that you might want to consider protecting or being concerned about, or at least taking into account when you sweep your crop or when you examine your crop for insect pests. You're also looking for those beneficials to understand, do you have something that's going to eat its way through this problem? Or in the case of something like Bertha armyworms, a native pest for us, often they'll have a virus or a fungal infection that might be able to decimate that population. So that's one of the things. The other things is to really understand the threshold and to understand how exact that threshold is, or how much you can rely on it. So Hector and I have a bit of a discussion on, how do we view the lygus threshold, and how do we view it in relation to the really detailed charts we had in the past and have since moved away from. So you need to understand that threshold and really what the cost or the penalty of ignoring that threshold is. And there's 2 points to that. One, you want to make sure that you're not having your crop eaten away from you and you're losing significant revenue. But also there's a point on all of those thresholds where the insect isn't doing that much damage. And you really should leave it there, perhaps to fuel some of those biological pests, viral, fungal infections that will take down that population, maybe not this year, but will build into coming years. So I think that's the 2 things that are really critical for growers to understand.
Great. Ale, did you have a take on this as well? Maybe I'll hand it.
He covered very much the main things. I would add that it's important to use the thresholds as much as possible to avoid overuse of insecticides, because not only you're wasting your money if you're not getting an economic return, but you are exposing this pest without the need to these insecticides. And we know from flea beetles from previous products that were used and other flea beetles in other parts of the world, that they will become resistant. So not only you're wasting your money, but eventually you're losing the only or the more reliable tool you have to control them. So it's very important to avoid excessive use of insecticides because eventually you'll lose that tool.
Right. And Hector, did you want to add something to this sustainable management of strategies here? Go ahead.
Yeah, certainly. I totally agree with the idea of thresholds. I'd like to maybe take a step back a little bit and discuss about the topic of diversity in time and space, and how farmers can utilize those concepts, use those concepts to help them manage insect pests more sustainable. So what do we mean by diversity in time and space? It kind of sounds a little up there and not very clear, but we're really talking about about crop rotations, so diversifying your cropping systems in terms of what you plant in what sequence. And I think the more crops that you can integrate into your rotation, you are going to limit the amount of food available for an insect pest. And somebody will say, well, but these insects can fly very far. Just because you plant canola this year and you plant wheat the other year, they can still fly from one field to the other. Yes, but the less food that you make available for them one year, there's less resources for them, and we expect them that we should have an impact on the populations. So that's one thing that farmers can do, and it's not always easy to do this. But if a farmer could also incorporate forage, more longer term, more semi-perennial crops, we know, for example, that crops like alfalfa, they can harbor a huge number of insects. There's hundreds and hundreds, and they can be excellent sources for predators like ladybird beetles, navid bugs. There's tons of various predators that can be harbored in those fields. The other thing is diversity in terms of space. And now here I'm getting into Ale's area of landscape ecology. We've done some really interesting work with Ale. We had a student at the University of Manitoba who did a PhD on Tetrasticus julis. Okay, this it's a tiny wasp, only like 1 millimeter by 1.5 millimeters, very small. But that tiny insect really packs a huge punch to control the cereal leaf beetle in wheat. And with that student, Arash Heirodin, we showed that if you have canola and alfalfa close to wheat, you actually can get higher parasitism of that cereal pest. So what you plant, when you plant it, where you plant it, the configuration can be important and can have consequences on the sustainability of management of that crop pest.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think that came up in Ala's presentation as well. So, right, looking at a landscape and understanding what should be grown around the field that you might be managing, and then the rotations that are on your own field. So I think that's critical. Maybe I can get some comments on timing of understanding when a pest is really a pest. You brought this up in your presentations individually, when should you scout a field, maybe early on or later on, and how climate change can also affect timing, generations, and so forth. So if you're a producer out there and you want to, get ahead of the problem, obviously, you want to know when to look. So maybe I'll start with Ale this time and give him the floor to discuss that a bit. When should one look for, whether it's flea beetles or lygus bugs, when should that start?
For lygus, I would defer to to Hector and Keith that have way more experience. For flea beetles, really early on, as soon as the canola emerge, they are vulnerable because these adults come very hungry from overwintering. They can feed on weeds and other brassicas, but really there's not a lot of plants out there. And they're specialists. They're able to detect them from potentially long distances and colonize these fields very quickly and start producing damage. And that's one of the challenges that I think he's alluded. It's very hard to predict where they are going to occur or when they are going to occur, because they might a little bit off in terms of when the peak of flea beetles occurs and when the canola emerge may result in a year that people think, oh, there's no damage, there's no flea beetles. In reality, pretty much we have flea beetles all year. If you look for them, you'll find them every year in every place, but they might not be at the wrong time for your crop, right? They might completely miss the susceptible stage. And canola it's an amazing plant in the sense that within a couple of weeks grows to an enormous size. So these flea beetles, which are very detrimental when it's a seedling, in a couple of weeks do absolutely nothing to the same plant because it's super big, right? So it's a matter of timing, but you need to be on top when the plants are small, because if you're in an unlucky situation, you might receive lots of damage. The other thing I was going to say, also along with Keith, is we have projects with Hector and others across the prairies trying to work down these thresholds. And actually, for us, we wanted to have damage. We needed damage to estimate the proper threshold. And we have a hard time getting damage in our plots. So it's always intriguing to me that you hear farmers, there's always problem, always a big pest. But we have started studying. I started this in 2015. I think the first project. Hector worked on this a lot earlier than me, and it's always a challenge to get them. So they're not all the time they're causing, extreme damage. Most of the time they are managed very well, probably with the seed insecticides, but probably they're not at huge numbers during those 3 or 4 weeks that are critical. And that's it. There could be lots of them, and they would be inconsequential. So, yeah.
So they don't cooperate with the schedule of a researcher or the farmer. So we got to be mindful
it's like
of
it
that.
was mentioned before. As soon as you have a funding to do it, they won't show up where you want them.
Right. So maybe on the lygus bug side, Hector and Keith, you can add your thoughts on when to get on a field and look for them, or determine that economic threshold you were talking about. Hector, maybe I can turn it over to you.
Sure. Yeah, and I would add that this applies to lygos, flea beetles, but actually to every insect pest. And something that is really important to remember whenever we discuss a threshold, that threshold relates to density, abundance, or level of damage, right, for the insect or the plant, but also a very specific crop stage. So those are the two things that the growers, agronomists, they need to keep in mind. So when we talk about lygus bugs, we're really talking about the end of flowering stage. That is the stage in general. There's always exceptions to everything, right? But in general, that is the stage when lygus bugs are going to have the greatest risk and potentially affect the crop, because at the end of flower, the canola pods are going to have small seeds that are still juicy enough and soft, and that's the key time. Before that, some people asked the question, and we actually had a study with Keith where we were looking at, can you spray for Cave seaport weevil, another pest that we have in southern Alberta, in Saskatchewan also. You don't have it in Manitoba, at least not in big numbers yet, but it's there already. So can we, farmers always ask this question, can we spray for Cave seaport weevil at the early flower stage and get rid of all the insects like lygus bugs? And we did an experiment and we tried in farmers' fields, and the answer was a little bit complicated. But basically, yes, you can reduce the lygus numbers to a point, but if you're going to have a lygus outbreak and have them over threshold and damage the crop, it doesn't matter if you spray early. So you still have to sample that field at the critical crop stage. So the key message is you have to get out there and sample at the correct stage. And the question of timing is really, really interesting and very important, because earlier we were talking about diversifying crop rotations and so on. And something that is also important when you spray for insect pests in canola, you have to remember that that field had another crop the year before, for example, had wheat. And in the southern prairies, we have another pest called the wheat stem sawfly. And it happens that at the time when you're spraying for insect pests at the flower stage, that is the time when the parasitoids of the wheat stem sawfly are flying. So you might be creating problems in the future for wheat stem sawfly or for your own field close by, because you might be, yes, you're controlling the Cave seaport weevil, or a pest, or you're trying to control lygus too early, which you shouldn't be doing, and then you're going to be shooting yourself in the foot by actually killing a lot of these beneficial insects, the parasitoids that are going to help you to control another pest, wheat stem sawfly in wheat.
Right. So it's tricky, and don't be lazy. Get out there, look at different times, different growth stages, different fields. Not quite complex. Keith, did you want to add to the discussion at all on timing, maybe, of scouting and?
I think they covered all the bases.
Okay.
So for these two particular insect pests, flea beetles it's really critical to get out and scout when the crop is struggling, and at the first sign of damage to take a look at that damage and realize what's the potential that it's going to get worse. Because typically when a grower is really concerned about flea beetles, it's because he's come and looked at the field 7 days too late. You're looking at a field that already has 50% plus damage. It's had that damage for quite some time, and the grower's reacting to some pretty ugly looking crop. But if you have very few plants, or if they're growing very slowly, if if it's been cool and dry for quite some time and then it suddenly warms up, well, the insects are cued into the environment probably better than the plants are. They start eating and doubling their feeding rate every time it warms up by another 5 degrees. So if it's dry, warm weather or even hot weather, the flea beetles can do a lot of damage, I would say faster than growers are really aware. And if you add that thin crop or that struggling crop together with perhaps it's taken a very long time to get where it is, your seed treatments have started to wear out at about week 3 or week 4. So, it's kind of a layered approach. Unfortunately, it goes from bad to worse. And under warm, dry conditions, it goes from bad to terrible really quickly. So just be aggressive scouting that particular insect. It's a really easy insect to see the damage for the most part. The shot holes are pretty visible. They will sometimes feed on the stems. So, if your crop, what I typically say there is if your crop doesn't look better every 2 or 3 days that you're going out to look at it, then you should be pulling the plants up and looking, and maybe it's a root rot or something else that's completely separate from an insect, but really need to see that crop making the progress you'd like it to have. And ligas are a completely different beast. We can start finding ligas as soon as it warms up here on the prairies. You'll find the odd one creeping into your truck or in the ditch when you're going to check the field at seeding time. But that's not really an indication of if we're going to have a problem in that field. So they're going to lay some eggs. Hector's already mentioned that they're really tiny. I'm sure they make phenomenal food for insect predators that are out there when they're in a really nice, soft, juicy body. And I've heard many times, I haven't had it necessarily proven to me, that heavy rains will wash ligas out of the crop canopy and probably contributed to those few years where we really haven't had many. And I sincerely hope that in 2024 someone's telling me that story, because most of the prairies are pretty dry, and we'd love to have rainfall as a causal agent of reducing ligas numbers. But that insect is a little harder to predict. If you go out and sweep at the end of flower, and there's 2 reasons for that. One, we're really not going to recommend you spray the canola crop at full flower because it's home for a lot of biodiversity that's looking for nectar. It's a phenomenal source of nectar for honeybees in particular, but any other insect that's looking for some sugary food, canola is a nice flower to do that. So you don't want to be spraying any crop while it's flowering. And the crop hasn't yet got to a stage where they're sucking those seeds necessarily. So go out at the end of flower, assess for ligas bugs, see if you've got some in the net in a high enough number that it concerns you, and then come back in 3 days to 7 days, and confirm your earlier impression and be ready to manage them if you're so inclined. But the threshold is fairly important, and developing a bit of a tolerance or an understanding for what you're going to do with ligas bugs is I think fairly regionally specific.
That's great. I mean, these guys sound like Manitobans. The moment it gets warm, everybody's just scurrying around doing their thing. So 15 degrees is like the gun going off. So I can see that totally. I do have a follow-up on Keith's last point there, with pollinators being obviously very important to all of us. And I also speaks to Ala's point about over-application or resistance to certain chemicals, and being mindful about spraying, not just from a perspective of cost to the farmer, but also from understanding what it does to the environment, to other species of that are important to us, and to resistance. So maybe before I turn it over to the audience and field a couple questions, did you care to comment on that a bit further? So particularly as it relates to over-application of chemicals, what that does to some beneficial pollinators, and then tolerance. So maybe I'll start with Hector this time.
Yeah, certainly. We like Keith mentioned, it's not a good idea to spray insecticide on a crop during the flowering stage, because we know that pollinators are attracted to that crop, and we really would like to avoid that. If somebody had to spray for some reason, there was a huge outbreak of some insect pest, then they should take into consideration the time of the day when they could avoid spraying, perhaps spray after the peak hours during when the insects are not flying as actively. That might mitigate to some extent the risk of killing too many of the beneficial insects. But in general, one should avoid to spray the insecticide during flowering times. And there's tons and many kinds of beneficial insects, not only pollinators, but I think Keith also mentioned that there are natural enemies. For example, there are many wasps that rely on pollen and nectar, and it's been shown many times that if you provide these natural enemies like parasite or wasp with a source of extra fuel, they can actually live longer lives and lay more eggs and attack more of the insect pests. So it's really important. And in a crop like fava beans that I mentioned earlier, it's crucial that you do not spray, because the crop relies very heavily on pollination. So you may reduce the pest numbers by spraying for lygus bugs, but you actually may end up with lower yield even if you didn't spray, because you're actually reducing the seed set that is attributed to pollinators. So that's an extremely important aspect to take into consideration.
Great. Any other thoughts on this? Ale, maybe you can also address the idea of over application and resistance. And we have had lots of news in the popular press around resistance and then health effects to pollinators, and maybe finding alternatives and how difficult that might prove. So if you don't mind commenting on that quickly.
Yeah, the other important consideration I think that sometimes we overlook is that the use of pesticides generate the need to use pesticides more and more, because most of these insecticides are what we call broad spectrum, so they will kill pretty much all the insects or a large group of them, whether they're beneficial or not. And what happens typically is the pests like Flibitus or Lygus, they are pests for a number of reasons. Some we understand, some we don't. But typically they have a very, very good potential to increase very rapidly. So they have high reproduction, very good ability to use resources very quickly. Whereas predators, parasitoids, those beneficials, they typically are not so prolific, because they depend on their pests to build up their population. So the pests always have a head start. So if we go and spray, we kill the beneficials, but we leave the crop, which is the main source for the pest. And the pests have a really big head start. So it's becoming more difficult for these natural enemies to reestablish in the field and control them. So we need to apply again to control the pest. And that generates that we have our crops, despite that if you go and you'll see an amazing number of insects, most of them very inconsequential from the production point of view. They are not pests. A lot of them are beneficial, but there's not a lot of insects there because there's a lot of use of insecticides. So in some systems that they have stopped or reduced a lot the use of insecticides, they have seen over time a buildup of these beneficials that reduce or even make completely unnecessary to use insecticides in some cases. One famous case is rice in the Southeast Asia, right? That once they stop using insecticide, and they stop because the insecticides couldn't keep up with the pest, right? The pest adapted to them, and they were just not being able to control them. So they stopped using them altogether in some wide areas. And with time, those very bad pests they have, they actually became controlled by natural enemies. So it's important to try to break that cycle, use them whenever it's necessary, but only as the last resource and not as the first approach to manage pests.
Great. Yeah, Hector, did you want to add to that? I see your hand up.
Yes. I just remember a couple of things that I forgot to mention when you asked the question about the issue with protecting beneficial insects. Two things that people can do also. One is that we are beginning to see in the market some products that are a bit more selective, and actually there's some products that do not kill Hymenoptera, like wasps, like bees, natural enemies. So it's important to think about those, right? Of course, that's part of the solution. I think more long-term, more sustainable solution will be to find alternative farming systems, right, that rely less on insecticides. And one that I can mention that we have worked on in southern Alberta is a trap crop system for cabbage seed-pod weevil. And it's not one that is used very widely, because often these more complex farming systems, they require more more activities, and our farmers are so large that people don't have a lot of time. But I can just describe very, very quickly what a trap crop is for Cabeciporus weevil. Basically, is using the perimeter of the field as a trap crop for the Cabeciporus weevil, and farmers can actually use canola planted a little bit earlier, say 7 to 10 days planted earlier, and then the rest of the crop, 90% of the field will be the main crop, can be to the planted at the say a week, 10 days later, and then the Cabeciporus weevil and might work a bit for flea beetles. This is something that hasn't been researched, but for sure, Cabeciporus weevil, they get attracted to the crop at the flower stage, so they will concentrate on the border, and then farmers can control them there. It'd be nice to have a non-chemical alternative, like maybe something like a entomopathogenic fungi that was kind of less aggressive on other insects. But for the time being, I think insecticides are the only option to use in the trap crop. But that's one option that we know it works for Cabeciporus weevil. It could be researched for other insects also. We know it has some potential for something like pea leaf weevil, for example. Any insect that is aggregated along the borders and exhibits that distinct crop edge effect like flea beetles do, except flea beetles, they move so fast that it might not work as well. But anyway, I thought I should mention that.
No, that's good. I think we want to take a few minutes here to answer a few questions from our audience. So I'm just going to remind the audience that you can access this through our Slido URL, and the code is #CanolaBugs. So let me start by a question that was posed around crop rotations, and Hector addressed this already, but not in these specifics that was questioned. Question is, what is the recommendation for the best number of crops in rotation as a way to reduce food supplies generally for pests? So I'm sure there's a broad answer to this, but maybe Hector, I can throw it back at you.
Sure. I wish I had an exact answer, but we don't have one. It actually stimulates my brain in thinking about a research question that one could ask, though. Anecdotally, I've noticed that farmers that tend to spray less are the ones that have greater rotations. Like I know a few farmers in around Lethbridge who hardly ever spray insecticides, and they have several crops, and I don't know what the magic number is. I think they have more than 4 crops in the rotations, and I know one that somehow they have a mixed operations with the livestock and also crops. So they actually have incorporated a very short perennial crop, alfalfa, as a forage crop in 2 or 3 years, and then they plant canola, peas, flax, mustard, and so on. So they have, I think the answer is, I don't know the exact number, but I think the longer the rotation, probably the better.
Great. That's a good rule of thumb. And then diversity should help, right? So that makes sense to me. So maybe I'll move on to the next question. This is in regards to those thresholds that you have mentioned during your presentations. So the question is, what are the recommended thresholds for insecticide applications for flea beetles and lygus bugs? And it came up in Keith's slide there, as well as Alan mentioned this. So maybe I'll start with Keith. Can you remind us what the kind of the recommended thresholds might be?
Sure. Well, I hope Hector will comment on this, but Hector just did a multi-year analysis of a lot of Western Canadian data on lygus bugs. And the number that we came up with was 20 to 30 in 10 sweeps. And it's important to sort of understand that that's in 10 sweeps, multiple locations in the field. So you have a really good idea. My experience with lygus bugs has been that they've spread themselves out relatively uniformly in canola. And once they're in a canola field, they don't move much because the food is the same where I'm sitting and the same 6 or 10 feet away. But that 20 to 30 is a really good number. And the reason that I like that 20 to 30, even though I think, Hector, it should be higher, hopefully I get a smile out of you with that. Even the original work that was done to establish thresholds for lygus indicated, for example, that with adequate rainfall, sometimes we couldn't find a yield penalty from lygus bugs. So the plant has the ability to compensate really well. And the 20 to 30 at least makes it sound like there's a bit of a range there. And agronomists in central Alberta, west of Highway 2, where we often have pretty nice soil and good rainfall, many of the agronomists that I talk to use a number like 50 to 80 in 10 sweeps. So they're using a number that's quite a bit higher, but at least it's a range and it's a relatively high number. The previous charts, which we won't show on the screen, they're still floating around on the internet, would have us with $8 canola and $8 insecticide spraying as few as 0.8 Lygus in one sweep or 8 Lygus in 10 sweeps. And they went up in 1 or 2 Lygus increments, and the whole chart quit at about 35. So you got the idea that when you swung a net and found a Lygus bug, that you better do something now, and that we really understood that every Lygus bug, some of the charts even had this, eats 0.00832 of a bushel. It was very prescriptive, and that's never been my experience with Lygus bugs. So the thresholds are, I'm going to say, a rough guide for Lygus bugs, whereas the threshold for flea beetles, it's a more of a nice picture to scare you into action. We don't anticipate that you're going to see damage that will cause economic loss before you have 50% damage on that on those cotyledons or that 1 to 4 leaf stage. But because that damage can happen so quickly, we move that action threshold down to 25% damage, and that looks ugly enough to spur spraying at any point from a grower, because 25% missing from your crop looks horrendous on canola. But the challenge is trying to understand, is this crop growing? Is it surviving? Do I still have flea beetles actively eating? Am I looking at that first leaf that's coming through between these cotyledons that look really ugly, and I don't see any feeding damage? There's some opportunities to really understand what that insect's doing. But the real opportunity is just understand if you're at risk from damage, because a lot of canola fields are coming up well. They've got 5 to 8 or maybe even 10 or more plants per square foot. Some moisture there, some nice temperatures. Really don't see very much feeding. Chances are that you can, I hate to say go to the lake, but chances are your seed treatment's working and your risk is relatively low. But on flea beetles in particular, to understand if you're in a high risk for damage, and then to have an action plan for what you're going to do. So flea beetles are such aggressive feeders that I often tell growers, if you're struggling with this decision, or if you're scouting and we've told you now you better scout more often, maybe you're scouting every day or every second day, maybe you also need to go to your retailer and pick up your insecticide so you've got it on the farm, so that you don't make the decision and then drive to town and the dealer might say, well, I can have that for you tomorrow. So we need to aggressively manage flea beetles, and if a foliar insecticide is required, then to make sure that you get the most activity out of that with the least environmental impact that we can arrange.
Great. No, that's really good information for everybody. I think I want to move on to the next question, because we're going to run out of time pretty quick. And I think Keith just brought this up, seed that are treated with insecticides. So the question is, can you please comment on seed treated insecticides for these two insects, flea beetles and Lygus bugs specifically? So who wants to take a stab at that? Give us a bit more information on this technology. Maybe we'll start with Ala this time. Ala, did you want to comment on seed treatment?
Yeah, so what I would say is for flea beetles mostly. I do not know if they're active at all against Lygus later on. I believe not, probably. But for flea beetles, yes, they seem to be. I must say, I would try to ask people not to use insecticide. But having said that, every time we do experiments, we can tell what treatment had insecticides in the seed. So they do decrease the damage, right? Whether that's economical or not, it's a different question. But they do work to reduce damage. The other aspect, perhaps, so the products that are currently on the market that are mostly neonicotinoids, but there's a couple of new products, and Keith will know much better than me. They do work. They do work better for one species than the other. One of them seems to be tolerant. That species happened to become more and more abundant with time in recent years. So maybe we are selecting, or we are favoring that species by the products we use. But the other thing I want to mention quickly is using seed insecticides means peace of mind for the farmer, which is absolutely understandable, but also means applying insecticide at times that they're not needed, right? Because we don't know if those fields will ever be colonized with flea beetles. So it is a practice that it's not sustainable in the long term, and that's why we need to find alternatives. Because we are using a lot of insecticide when in fields that really don't need it, because there won't be insects there attacking them. And of course, that's the challenge. We can't predict that, and that's what makes it difficult for the farmers to make a decision to not use these insecticides. But really, we should try to move to more sustainable techniques than that.
Great. Well, I'm going to have to give you the last word, Ale, because we're out of time. But certainly this hour has flown by, and I very much enjoyed the discussion. So thank you, Ale, Hector, and Keith for joining us today and giving this excellent information to all of us. I just want to make sure that you know that this series is continuing. There's one more seminar or conversations that will come up before the academic year is over. And we'll see if this will be virtual or in person, but I certainly welcome you there. And watch for other notices on our social media accounts or by visiting makemanitoba.ca, and make sure you take part in these discussions and these opportunities. So with that, thank you everybody for joining me today, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.